All right, everybody, welcome back. This is part 3 of our case on the mysterious disappearance and death of Chuck Morgan.
Yes.
Amy, how are you?
I'm so good.
We've been taking little breaks in between because there's so much to talk about. We're getting so excited. We're going to have heart attacks.
Yes.
So we need a breather.
Yes.
All right. Well, if you haven't listened to part 1 and 2, you're definitely going to want to go back and do that first so that you can understand the storyline in chronological order, right?
There's a lot to digest. So we apologize for fire hosing you with information.
In part 1 and 2, we go over, like I said, the death and the disappearance. We go into some of the theories because it's an unsolved murder up until now. Because today, Amy, we're going to solve it.
Are we? You said up until
now.
No,
I just really wanted to say that for once in my life. All right, let's jump into part 3. This is the journalist, the mistaken hit, and the informant who supposedly committed suicide in his bathtub.
Yeah.
Amy,
there's a lot.
This one's all you. You deep dive this part of the story, and I can't wait to hear it.
Yeah, a little bit. So we're going to start with the journalist that was mentioned in the first couple episodes. His name is Don Devereaux. And
great journalist name, by the way.
Yeah. Oh, of course.
Perfect.
Of course, perfect journalist name. He was a veteran of the U.S. Army, and he was serving during the Korea War.
Oh, wow.
So anyway, he started into journalism and then got interested in investigating Morgan after he passed away.
Well, and he saw the episode of Unsolved Mysteries about Chuck Morgan, right?
Well, he
was
part
interested by
of
it.
That first one, and they kind of interviewed him because he had already been studying the case. And so after that first episode aired, for those of you who watched the first episode or may have been familiar with the first episode, there was a follow-up like the following season. And so in between the first and second episode, like Unsolved Mysteries had received like 600 plus leads from the original broadcast. And Don Devereaux went and followed every single one. And he was really, really involved in kind of tracking down. And these are kind of his findings from those leads that came in from that original broadcast.
Wow, that's a lot of leads.
Yeah. Yeah.
I wonder how long it took him to do all of that.
I don't know. In between the first and second, in between season 3, episode 9, and season 4, episode 25.
Right, which are the episodes of the Unsolved Mysteries show. And the second episode I found to be a really good follow-up to the first one.
Yeah, it had a lot more information.
Sure did.
Okay, so for our viewers, just to refresh, Chuck Morgan, he was involved in money laundering through his escrow company in Tucson, Arizona, just to kind of recap. And he was doing large transactions in gold and platinum. And these transactions occurred weekly and monthly between 1973, when he was killed, and 1977. And he was doing in excess of $1 billion a year, which is crazy.
And he was, just really quick to stop you, killed in 1977.
Yes.
Because he wasn't killed in 1973. Otherwise, that would be really creepy if he was doing 4 more years of escrow work beyond the grave.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. Like, I meant like the transactions with like the gold that Don Devereaux was able to track happened between 73 and 77.
So he had a 4-year streak of committing this crime. I mean, maybe we shouldn't call it that right now.
Money laundering, basically.
Doing these transactions.
Because what he was doing, there wasn't actually any like gold or platinum. He was just writing it, from what I understand, and then having it go through different banks to be kind of legitimized. And so he was like funneling all this mob money.
Right. So he would take the false transaction, basically write it out, and then spin it through so many different institutions that eventually it kind of disappeared into the records.
Well, yeah, and it legitimized the money.
Sure.
So Don Devereaux was able to track all this. And in today's money, you guys, this is like $8 billion.
Wow.
Like it's crazy the amount that just occurred in 4 years. So, and most of the money laundering scheme that Don Devereaux was able to, I'm going to slip up on his name every time, I feel like.
Okay.
It's a tongue twister.
DD. We could call him DD.
Was coming out of Southeast Asia. And it was happening towards the end of the Vietnam War. So that's kind of like what was going on. A lot of people seem to have been involved, including, and he uses this word, renegade folks from the U.S. intelligence community. And his definition of renegade is basically those operatives that are currently employed with the U.S. government, but kind of have the side gig that is not adhering to the constitutional rules that they're supposed to follow.
It's not in their job description.
Yeah, right.
You're not supposed to be stealing stuff out of Asia and bringing it over here.
No.
Wow.
So the CIA operatives were perhaps undercover from agencies and that were perhaps in their own to line their own pockets. Don found out that the Vietnamese government officials that were going into exile were involved.
No way.
Well. Yeah. And he found that people from the Department of Defense were probably involved in this renegade capacity, but not in an official capacity again. Kind of how he's wording things. And he discovered that Chuck kept duplicate records of the illicit transactions. And his thought behind this is Chuck probably thought that keeping a duplicate of all this information would be kind of quote unquote a life insurance policy.
Right. And I did mention that a little earlier too. Like there could have been multiple reasons, like bargaining, bribing. He could have done a few things with them.
Yeah. Well, and also too, if he's going to be an informant, like he at least needs like kind of credible evidence too,
right.
You know? So, but instead, according to Don, it served to be a death warrant. And Don Devereaux now believes that Chuck was killed because he still had these records. Chuck was on the run the last few months of his life, especially in the last 10 days, which we had all gone over like in the previous episodes.
He was super paranoid.
Yeah. And
rightfully so.
Yeah. During this time that Don is investigating, the death of Doug Johnston happened.
Okay, here's the trick to this episode.
Yeah.
Or this part of the episode. Amy's going to go over Don, Doug, and Dan. So you got to follow closely.
I know.
We'll try and keep them all straight.
And unfortunately, they were all D names.
Yeah, and there's no shorthand for these names because what do you call Don for short? D. What do you call Doug for short?
Yeah.
Also D. What do you call Dan for short?
I mean, we'll
Still
try
D.
to use their whole names so that you can kind of follow along maybe, but...
No, I have a quick question for you before you get into these a little bit because I don't recall this part. So Chuck died in 1977. The Unsolved Mysteries episode comes out way later, and this is around the time that Don Devereaux is starting to investigate and get interested in it. Mm-hmm. So what time period are we in now?
So we are in 1990.
Okay, so it's a few years later, over a decade later.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, and if you can picture, so we're still in Arizona. We're in the Phoenix area. And then Don Devereaux's office is across the street. I know this is it's going to sound weird at first, and people are going to be like, why is she talking about this? But I promise you, it's all going to come together. Across the street from Don's office is Doug's work.
Okay, Doug Johnston.
Doug Johnston's work.
Right.
So, okay. So, just to back up a little bit, his name is actually Peter Douglas Johnson, but he goes by Doug.
Well, it would have been really helpful if he went by Peter for our sake.
I know. And he was born in October 21st, 1954. And like I said, we're going to fast forward. He is about 3 months after the airing of the Unsolved episode, the first one.
Okay, so we're still in 1990s.
Yeah.
Okay. Yep.
Okay, and it's actually 13 years after the death of Charles Morgan. Okay. So on May 14th, 1990, at 11 p.m., Doug Johnston, who is now 35 years old, left for work as usual. He works the night shift. His job was the night shift at a local computer graphics company.
Okay. So nothing like journalism.
No, he's just this
good old boy who's amazing at
he's
graphics.
IT guy. Okay. An hour later, Doug Johnston was found dead in his company parking lot. He had been shot behind his left ear, one time from a distance of at least 12 inches.
Wow.
Now, this is really crazy what goes down because from everybody else in the public cannot understand what happens next. Police at first glance felt his death appeared to be a suicide.
Of course it is. I mean, that's the easiest out you could take. You're like, look, this is mysterious. Let's just call it a suicide.
Oh my gosh.
He got out his go-go gadget arm.
I guess maybe less paperwork. Who knows?
And you said he was killed in his car, right?
In his car.
Okay.
He's sitting in his car. He hadn't even gotten out of his car to go into his office. Hey, the problem, Doug Johnston was right-handed. So he's going to shoot himself in the left, behind his left ear, one time, 12 inches apart, but being right-handed.
I said he got his go-go gadget arm out. Okay, so I have a quick question for you.
Yeah.
I really don't know this part. I mean, I know about the deaths, but I don't know this part. So he was in his car, found in his car.
Yeah.
He has a bullet wound to the back of his head.
Yeah. Behind
Is any of the glass shattered? Did someone shoot from outside the vehicle, or was someone sitting behind him?
From all the reenactment and footage I've been able to see, it looked like his windows were rolled down.
Oh.
So it's May in Phoenix at night.
That's true. Good point.
1990s. Maybe not all cars had ACs in them. I don't know. But anyway, windows seem to have been rolled down. There was no gun found at the scene. Police ruled this a suicide.
So maybe he took his go-go gadget arm and threw the gun so far it was never found. This is logical. I mean, really, Phoenix PD, hire me.
Yeah, I mean, who knows? There was no gunpowder residue on Johnston's hands. And there was a police detective, Harvey E. Hamrick, and he will talk about him a little bit later, but I'm not coming for him, but that's who the police detective was at the time.
Well, is Harvey still alive? Do we know?
I don't know. I didn't look that up.
For him. Okay. All right.
Okay. At the scene, police recover a .25 caliber bullet casing.
Okay.
So different gun than Charles.
13 years ago?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
might have gotten a new one.
The medical examiner determined it was just as likely that Doug Johnston committed suicide as it was someone else did it.
What does that even mean? How is it either or?
Yeah, it just means well, the evidence is here. Is the evidence there?
I don't think so.
Just as likely?
If there's no gun, the windows were rolled down, so we don't know if they were shot through or not. What evidence?
Yeah, no gunshot residue. Oh, goodness sakes.
What a mystery.
Yeah. Okay. So police detective Harvey Hamrick stated because of the medical examiner's findings, they cannot classify his death as a suicide or as a murder.
Oh, okay. They're like, wait a second. That doesn't sound right. Let's take it back a little bit. Dial it back. We didn't mean the either or thing.
Yeah. So it's just, I didn't see the medical examiner's report, to be fair. So I don't know what his death is. Maybe just unknown, or is it just gunshot to the head?
Cannot be determined.
Yeah, but the reason, I don't know. Okay, here's where it gets kind of Doug's widow, Denise, and Doug did have a daughter named Amber, and he had just barely graduated from school in April. He was super excited about this job. She was there's a lot of good things happening right now for that family. And she swears that he would have never committed suicide. And not only did he just graduate, but he graduated with honors. So he was a really smart guy and was she didn't feel like suicide was even in the realm of possibilities.
Yeah, she knows him probably the best out of anyone around, right?
Yeah. Okay. Doug's car was a Toyota station wagon, and it was similar to Don Devereaux's car, the one that he was driving. Now, Don contacted Phoenix PD and stating the similarities and the fact that he was investigating Charles Morgan's death, and police didn't seem to think it was much of a.
Okay, so our journalist, Don Devereaux, who's deep diving this case.
Yeah,
yep.
Charles Morgan.
He works
all of the
fraud, money
money
laundering crimes.
Yeah.
He calls the police department and says, "Hey, look, I work right across the street from this guy.
Mm-hmm.
I drive almost the exact same vehicle.
Yeah, and at night,
it's nighttime.
Yeah,
and both of our names start with a D."
Well, I don't know that he said.
No, it definitely wasn't relevant, but I think it's a great connection. So Don is alluding.
I think they took out the wrong person.
Right.
But I think it has to do with this Chuck Morgan case.
So it was a mistaken hit.
Yes.
Wow.
Okay. And this is where it gets kind of weird.
What do you mean this is where it gets weird?
Doug Johnston's parking lot, like we stated, was right across the street from Don Devereaux's parking lot. There is a 1-digit difference in the address.
Oh my goodness.
In fact, Mel used to be mistakenly given to the other party. They were always receiving each other's mail.
Oh my gosh. I mean, that would be annoying to get each other's mail, but imagine how annoying it would be to catch someone else's bullet. That's awful.
Yeah. So that's
Poor Doug.
the story of Doug.
And poor Doug's family.
Oh, poor Doug's family and his daughter.
Okay, so that's where that part wraps up. That's all we know because there was no further investigation into his death.
Yeah. Yeah. It's still unsolved. And I wasn't there in 1990. I don't know how hard the police actually looked into things because from the outside, it looks like Doug Johnston was pretty squeaky clean. So they would have had to look at other theories. And I don't know why they dismissed Don's. I mean, I guess when people think like conspiracy theories, you know what I'm saying? People are often like, that's kind of weird. But there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that shows that he was maybe not the intended target.
Well, and there's the absence of physical evidence. There's no gun there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that's a great question. Did the police department just say, look, it's too complicated, we don't know?
Well, and a shot behind the ear, that's indicative of like
a non-suicidal death.
Yeah. Like, well,
a non-voluntary suicide.
Like, it could be a hit. You know what I'm saying?
Absolutely. There's very, very little. I mean, this is what I gathered from my sources too. So I can't say 100%, but it's very rare for someone to attempt to take their own life or to take their own life by putting a weapon behind their head, right? Which we talked about a little earlier too, right? With the wrong hand. But there's obviously a lot of opportunity in that setup to slip, to not get it correctly. I mean, this is a little dark that we have to talk about this, but
it's midnight and you're sneaking up on someone because there was no indication that Doug turned around, and he was shot from at least 12 inches.
Yeah, you're right. And because it's in the night, I almost wonder if this person, let's assume that it was someone else.
Yeah.
We're not going to stick with the suicide theory.
I don't think that there's any evidence to support the suicide theory.
There's not.
But I'm not a medical examiner.
Or a police department officer.
I don't know.
Okay, so there's a hitman.
Yeah.
And I would assume because Doug had just arrived at the parking lot.
Yeah, he hadn't even gotten out of the car.
Right, that he was
rolled
probably
up his windows, nothing. Like
sure.
That indicated that he was like exiting his vehicle.
Right.
From the reenactment.
He was probably being followed, which would be likely because the vehicles looked so similar, Don and Doug's.
Maybe they were waiting for him.
Yep, that could be true.
Because if you're given an address.
Sure. I mean, someone had to have gotten the address wrong somehow.
Yeah. I mean, one digit in the dark, like that would be pretty easy.
Yeah, very true. Wow.
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to move on to Danny. It's Dan. He went by Danny Casolaro. Joseph Daniel Casolaro was born on June 16, 1947. He was a freelance writer who was working on several government conspiracy theories in Washington, D.C.
So we have another investigative journalist.
Basically, yes.
All right.
He was divorced and had a son named Trey that he had legal custody. Okay, so in 1991, 1 year after Doug Johnston was killed, Don Devereaux, who's our journalist, was contacted by a writer from Washington, D.C. named Danny Casolaro. Don Devereaux agreed to share the information he had uncovered on Charles Morgan's illegal gold transactions. Before Don Devereaux could even mail him a copy of his file, Danny Casolaro was dead.
Wow.
So Danny was found on August 10th, 1991, in the bathroom of room 517 of the Sheraton Hotel in Martinsburg, West Virginia. His wrists were slashed deeply over a dozen times.
Okay. No, let's keep going.
The medical examiner and police ruled the death a suicide.
Oh my gosh. I didn't think you were going to say it, but you said it. Oh my goodness.
I'm only laughing at Sarah's reaction. I'm not laughing at the fact that this poor man was murdered.
Of course not. So we have two investigative journalists working or deciding that they're going to share information. They're working on somewhat of a similar project. Now, Danny was known to write or follow stories that had a lot of like conspiracy elements and stuff, right? Okay.
Exactly.
And before they meet...
Well, they weren't really going to meet up. Danny just called Don on the phone and just said, hey, I was wondering, as a fellow journalist, would you share with me your information? And they were talking on the phone, and Don was like, of course, let me package this up to you and send you what I have.
Okay.
And before he could mail the package, he heard that Danny Casolaro was dead.
So he hadn't mailed the package.
He hadn't mailed it yet.
Okay, so in my mind then that could only be one of two things, right? Danny has a long history of writing about, like I said, conspiracy.
Yeah.
You know, there's a lot of deep ties into his storytelling and stuff. Possibly there was already a hit out on him and this was just good timing.
Yeah.
Or bad timing, I should say. Or the only other logical explanation would be that Don Devereaux's phone was tapped.
I mean, that is a possibility. I do find it odd that, the timing, right? Which is what...
Right, because
timing is just
we're
weird.
not even quite a year past we're assuming mistaken death of Doug Johnston.
So it's a little over a year. Doug Johnston was killed on May 14th, 1990, and Danny was killed on August 10th, 1991.
Okay.
So a year and 3 months.
I wonder how you feel as the hitman. Not that we care about his feelings, but you accidentally whacked the wrong guy, and then Don Devereaux is still making phone calls. You're like, wait a second, I thought this was done.
Yeah. So, like I said, the medical examiner and the police ruled the death a suicide. Don Devereaux has never believed that Danny committed suicide. Now, Danny Casolaro's brother is a doctor, and his brother told Don Devereaux that his brother Danny was so squeamish that he was reluctant to allow his own brother to prick his finger to do any kind of blood sample work on him over the years. So anytime he needed like some sort of medical testing and he went to his brother, who's his doctor, to take care of it, he was so squeamish with blood for the blood that he wouldn't even want them to prick his finger.
Right, which is great insight from his brother. But also, I just want to put out there were about a dozen cuts on each wrist, right? That's what we gather, about 6 on each side.
Yeah, it just says his wrists were slashed.
Right, so that's my point.
Yeah.
If you are attempting to complete suicide, how do you get 12 cuts in? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, one
and
deep
also,
cut.
you found some information that I didn't read.
I did, yeah. So I knew that you had deep dive with your big old shovel into this part. So I wanted to leave it at that and be like a little bit surprised.
Yeah.
But I did see in one of the articles that I was reading, and I did hear it on another one of the podcast segments I listened to, that Dan, at the time that his body was taken out of the hotel room and then went to the coroner, right?
Sure.
The coroner determined that Danny was not alone at the time of his death. And that's what it says word for word. I don't have that document in hand, but it was quoted as a direct quote. And his finding was due to bruising found on Dan's head and arms, so fresh bruising.
Yeah.
And 3 of his fingernails were torn, as if he had been in a fight or defending himself.
Yeah.
So that alone is evidence to support, enough evidence for a coroner who, this is what they do professionally, right? To step back and say, look, you put this all together and there's no way that Danny completed suicide.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Truthfully, I don't think Danny's murder, I'm going to call it a murder because I don't think it was suicide.
We're going to go with that theory. Yep.
I don't think he had been receiving like harassing phone calls for quite some time. He had told multiple family members all of this stuff. There's a series on Netflix called American Conspiracy, The Octopus Murders. If you guys want to go check that out, that kind of deep dives more into Danny Casolaro. But I don't feel that Danny's murder had anything to do with Chuck Morgan. I think it was just purely coincidence that he was killed after his phone call with Don, because Danny had investigated some really high up things in our government.
Right.
And I do feel like that would have taken him out in relationship to where he was, like, Washington, D.C. He was found in
Virginia, right?
West Virginia.
Okay.
So, I just feel like, one of the things, which if you watch that series, you can see, but one of the things is that he had been investigating a theory that during the Iran hostage crisis, that Iran deliberately held back American hostages to help Ronald Reagan win the election. Like, we're talking about like really big, crazy tunnels that he had been investigating and that he was known to have investigated. And I just, from reading about him and from everything else between Doug Johnston and Charles Morgan, like, I just feel like Danny's was inappropriately timed as far as timing with Don Devereaux's conversation.
That makes a lot of sense. So all the stuff that Danny was diving into, right?
Yeah.
It went so far up the chain, right?
Yeah.
It was stuff that could ruin not only careers, but lives.
Yeah. I mean,
right?
It was international. There was like banking stuff. Like, I mean, it was like worldwide and high up in the U.S. government.
Okay.
That he's investigating.
I've got a question for you then.
Sure.
So I did see the reference to the octopus murders, but I purposely didn't look into it because I knew you were going to tell me about it. So in all of Danny Casolara's like research and as a part of the octopus story, maybe I'm just asking, are there any ties to South Asia where some of the stuff that we've referenced before with Chuck, are there any ties there where they maybe, I guess what I'm getting at, kind of onto the same story, but at very different times?
I mean, not that I was able to find. He was like investigating this Inslaw case, which was a software manufacturer, and the Justice Department stealing their work, and like a lot of Middle Eastern stuff. There was a lot of Iran instances that were happening, and bank collapses and different things like that he was kind of investigating. So he wasn't really in Southeast Asia, from what I've been able to gather. Now, I am not an investigative journalist. I did not deep dive really into all of the cases that he was looking at, and
we're not going to because
it didn't have anything to do as far as it's just another random coincidence in this story with Chuck Morgan.
In the storyline. Okay. So that all, I mean, it's tragic. All of it's very tragic, of course. But the only other theory really could be, again, like I mentioned, that Don Devereaux's phone or the wires were tapped.
So,
but I agree with you that makes a lot less sense than all of the preceding work that Danny Casolaro had been doing.
He was like active doing. But this is the one there. 6 months after Danny Casolaro's death, Don Devereaux received a call from another journalist.
Uh-oh.
And this journalist, again, is from the East Coast. This journalist told Don that he had a warning from a highly placed source in the CIA. This source told Don Devereaux that, quote, they thought they were getting to you when they got that guy in the parking lot, referencing who Don Devereaux is assuming Doug Johnston.
Wow.
Don Devereaux asked if it was a botched job, and the journalist says there have been and there still are contracts out to kill you, close quote. And Don asks plural. Now, I will say the reason why we know like what this is Don Devereaux actually recorded this conversation and has played clips of the conversation.
Oh, wow.
With this. So Don Devereaux's journalist friend said it had to do with something that Don was investigating that had both CIA and organized crime dimensions. To keep his head down and maybe leave town for a while was the warning that Don Devereaux received.
I mean, leave town for a while.
Yeah, I mean, Don Devereaux says that sometime later, 2 more sources, one from the CIA and one from Israeli intelligence, came forward to him confirming the death threats. And, I mean, he just kind of, Don Devereaux ended up, there was another journalist that was killed that he kind of ended up diving into that doesn't have anything to do with our case, but he was kind of involved in kind of figuring out who killed this other journalist.
Was the other journalist that you're referring to the one that died by a car bombing? Yeah, yes. I did see that a little bit.
His name is Don Bowles.
Another D. You're kidding me.
No.
Okay, so either some intelligence organization was taking out journalists or people investigating these ties and storylines, or they were just taking people out in alphabetical order and they hit all the D's.
I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it's kind of crazy. From an armchair detective standpoint, I don't even know that I want to use the word detective for me
No,
because
it's
I'm
not.
not.
We just want to say we're
No.
just telling a story. We have nothing to do with this. Please don't wipe your Google searches.
Yeah, no, I just kind of feel like if there really was a hit on Don Devereaux, like, and they botched one, like, why wouldn't they go after him again? Like, from everything that I kind of understand, like, there sometimes is lateral damage, quote unquote, but also too, like, their hit still ends up happening.
Right. Well, again, maybe his phone or his like form of communication was tapped, and at some point, if after he's talking to this friend who gave him the tip about the contract on his life, maybe he really did say, "All right, that's it, I'm out," and he goes silent.
And he worked on a different case or just kept his head down. Like, who knows? Who knows really at this point? I mean, he's pretty open in talking about his situation. He has his own like website, which we've referenced in our sources that you can message him like he's still out there.
Wow, that's amazing that not only did he survive what was said to be multiple contracts in his life, but he's still willing to talk about it publicly and share it on the internet. I mean, wow.
Yeah.
All right.
That kind of ends.
It ends the story 13, 14, we're getting into 15 years later, right? And unfortunately, in the telling of our case right here, there have been 4 men that have lost their life. I mean, when I say 4, I'm referring to that other journalist who died in the bombing as well, although that's not confirmed, but he did have a lot of the same ties, right?
Yeah.
Don Devereaux did an incredible job researching
and following leads for a really long time.
Enough leads to get him into a position where he was in trouble, which just leads back to the first part of our story where Chuck Morgan in Tucson, Arizona starts participating in or committing fraud. And here we are years and years later.
Yeah.
And it's like the ripple effects keep coming and coming.
Yes.
This is a deep one.
Yeah. Yeah. It's got a lot of avenues.
A lot of opportunities for puzzle pieces to fit together.
Yeah. And why conspiracy theories have lasted so long for this case.
Yeah. I mean, I'm blown away. I'm tired now. I'm exhausted. We've talked about it a lot.
That was a lot of information.
But this was a fascinating case. I was so excited to do this one, right?
Yes,
I couldn't wait to get it on the books. And I love the escrow tie to it a little bit because it shows a different element of real estate that can be very dangerous if misused.
Yeah.
Right? And
escrow is such an integral part of real estate.
Yeah, it's a required part of the process. Yeah. And I knew that there were a lot of conspiracy theories attached to this story, but I had no idea how deep it went until we started researching this one. Yeah. So this was very fun. Of course, tragic. Like I said, we're never taking away from that. But this one was fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. Well, Amy, as we're wrapping it up here, we always, at the end of our cases, are going to give our individual takeaways, right? Yeah. Which is either a little bit of insight to the real estate aspect of our story or the crime aspect of our story or both. So why don't you give us your takeaway first?
I mean, my takeaway is I think Charles or Chuck, however you want to refer to him, had every intention of being this really good stand-up guy. And he said yes to one thing that he probably felt was like not going to be that big a deal. And it opened up this whole big world where he's $1 billion in mafia, CIA type, like all of this crazy stuff. And just how quickly, like,
it got out of hand.
Off course going against your morals and values can lead.
Right. It's definitely, there's a lot of evidence that would point to what you just said, that he agreed or was a part of like maybe a one-time thing, right? We're going to do this once, we're going to do this twice, because it started happening in his life out of nowhere, right?
Yeah.
I mean, you can trace it back, but only so far.
Yeah,
at some
4
point,
years.
He was just legitimately running his own business. And it wasn't very long after that he was murdered. So that makes sense that it kind of, an opportunity presented itself, whether he was forced to do it or chose to do it, who knows? But he definitely got himself entangled in a very dangerous world and unfortunately, lost his life over it, and daughters lost their dad.
Yeah.
And it can't possibly be worth it, whatever the reward was in that moment, unless he was forced, right? Whatever the reward was to have ended up where it did.
Well, and you brought up his daughter, and his daughter had given like a quote to the newspaper, and she said, "My father had a lot of information about people here in Tucson that could have been very detrimental." And this is Megan. And there was a lot of information about politicians, people who are still alive that work in our government. He had that information, and they wanted to silence him.
Right. Wow. So your takeaway is basically, in a nutshell, it's not worth it.
No, yeah. I mean, no matter how you slice it or how you think like, oh, it won't be that bad this one time. Like, no, I mean, it can open
a dark door.
Yeah.
All right. That's a great takeaway. All right. So for mine, I want to get away from the perpetrator of the fraud in this storyline and talk about the potential for consumer fraud when it comes to title work, escrow work, and real estate transactions. So this is my takeaway and my tip. Okay. When you're preparing for a large transaction, whether you're buying, selling, whether you're buying one home, selling one home, or buying an apartment complex, or buying multiple properties, investments, whatever it is, whenever you're starting to transact, I say ask questions to the professionals that you've hired. So, I mean, of course, because we're on this podcast talking about this stuff, we both have the belief that you should involve an agent to help represent you in these types of transactions, right?
Yes.
But more often than not, you're also dealing with a lender who's lending money. And then, of course, we know that the title company is involved in the transaction as well. So start asking questions to the professionals that are involved in your transaction. Ask things like, who's going to be involved and what are their names? You know, hopefully the agent or the representative, I'll say, that you're working with has the foresight to introduce you to the players in your transaction. You know, this is who we'll be working with here. I want to introduce you here. But if that doesn't happen, I just want to recommend that you don't do anything blind. You know, verify everyone that you're working with, that you're talking to, that you're doing any transfers of money for. We do know in our day and age now that wire fraud has become a huge criminal part of real estate transactions, right? Where money gets wired from a buyer or seller to the wrong party. They're tricked into doing it, right? It's not an intentional choice, of course, but once that money goes, it's gone. It's not recoverable, right? You can make a report.
Every day.
It really does. And I've heard of it happening locally in our area here. This was years ago, but it happened to an agent that I knew to the tune of $40,000.
Wow.
So ask the professionals that you're working with, like what systems and what protections they have in place. Again, never wire money to anyone that you don't know directly, and never do it online.
Yeah.
So if you get a link in your email, or if you get maybe a text from a number you don't recognize that says, hey, I work here and I was told to send you the instructions, do not do it. Never, never, never do it. And if you're just unsure about it, you're not sure, ask. Call and ask. Get direct instructions and information on the steps that you're taking during the transaction for your own self-protection, right?
Yeah.
Don't give anyone cash ever in a real estate transaction. And don't open or answer like suspicious emails or contacts, kind of like I said. And just take those precautions and those steps. Now, as representatives of this industry that you and I are both passionate about, and with other professionals that we work with, like Justin, who visited with us today, and like other lenders, we trust with the relationships that we've built with them that they're keeping our clientele safe and that the business that we're doing is legitimate and honest. But what I'm saying is there's always good reason to have caution and a little bit of a sense of self-protection when you're making these large purchases and these big transactions, right?
Yeah, and I will say in the state of Utah, which is where we license.
Where we are, and we're never going to Arizona.
No, like if you're purchasing and you need the title company or the bank, like your closing costs, down payment, whatever, is in excess of $10,000, you have to wire money. There's no way around that. However, there's steps that you can do to make sure that when you wire your funds, that it's done safely. Always verify the wiring instructions. Don't blindly just wire them. Your bank will verify. Don't just trust your banking professional that they are just like, oh yeah, we put down the number where it's going to go. Call the title company or, wherever you're supposed to send that money and wire that. And I will say, I have never met an agent and I tell my clients this all the time, and I'm sure you do too, an agent will never need you to wire them money.
No.
So if you get an email from your agent that says like, hey, we need you to wire money, like that automatically is a red flag that there's someone that's gotten hold of an email account and they're trying to hack into, the transaction, really.
Right. And also, like, going right along with that, there's so much wire fraud going on. I mean, it's just prevalent out there. So like we said, like, take all the steps
if you know you're going to buy a house, change your email password. That's an easy thing.
That's very true.
Change your email password. So if your email was hacked or is on some sort of hacking list, because you won't know, because in 3 months you'll receive a letter from some service that you've used or whatever that, you've shopped at or whatever, that was like, oh, actually our servers were hacked and your email was compromised.
Right.
You never know that until after the fact. So if you're going into a big transaction, just change your password right away and then ask your agent, because I know we both do this and have been told to do this. Like, I don't send it. It doesn't say like wiring instructions. Like, it will say like a keyword, and I'll tell my client what that keyword will be. And it's usually like when the title company is sending it over, and I'll have clients call me, hey, the title company just sent this over. Is this what it is? And I'll be like, here, call this number, or, find the number of the title company that I gave you originally,
Yeah, no, that's a great tip.
So anyway, those are just a few things to kind of keep the public safe.
That's a really great tip. And kind of, again, along the lines that you were saying, agents will never ask you, never ask you, right? Yeah. Of course. But also, agents are never going to need your financial information. They don't need your bank account.
No.
They don't need your social security number, right? They
don't need your birthday.
No. That is up to the lender that you are applying for a loan with. Now, lenders are going to need very detailed and specific information.
Well, and even title company will, because they have to run reports.
Of course. But there are securities built into place with those companies that are highly managed, highly watched, right? And so that was just a great tip. Like, the agent that you're working with will never, or the agent's assistant, if they have one, right, should never ask for those types of information. I do also want to give another nod to Utah, right? We both love being licensed in Utah because they've done an excellent job with the legal documents that we use for these transactions, right? And one of them that is required for all clients to sign, right, which should be done at the beginning of the transaction when you're initiating an agent-client relationship, is called the wire fraud disclosure.
Yeah.
And I love this one in there. It's one page, but it goes into detail about wire fraud, the risk of it, how to avoid it. And then the client signs acknowledging that they understand and will be cautious. And I like this document because it never slips our mind to bring it up.
Yeah.
So I really appreciate that about Utah.
Yeah,
and again,
and even though the conversation is wire fraud is real.
Yeah, absolutely. So I do love that about Utah, that they've done a really thorough job at creating these documents that we use. So, all right. Well, those were both really good takeaways and great tips. I think we've put a lot of education out there today for our audience to learn. So I do just want to announce to our audience one more thing.
Perfect.
So we have been asked a couple of times, and it's been a suggestion from a few of our fans. We'll call them fans right now because they are people that like what we're doing. Listeners, that they would like to see some listeners or audience members, whatever we're calling them, write in some questions about real estate.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not just up to us to decide the topic every day, what we're going to talk about, but write a question down. And if it's, maybe if you're out of state, like you're not in the state of Utah, we won't be able to answer everything as thoroughly as we could if we were local, but we can still digest that question and come up with some help or some feedback. So we would like to invite anyone to send in some real estate questions.
Yeah.
And in our show notes, we will include the link to our email so you can send over your questions. And when we start getting those rolling in, we're going to take a little bit of time.
Is real estate and murder, you guys.
It's pretty simple. realestateandmurder.com. So write in some questions. Ask us anything.
Yeah.
All right. Amy, let's go take a nap.
All right. Sounds good.
Talk to you later.
Bye-bye.